Good morning. I look fine today. Well, it's time to get ready for your doctor's careers. You've been waiting forever. It seems like 10 years. You might be fretting about contracts or loans and where you should work or how to buy homes. Before we get started, there's some sponsors to thank. We Protect Doctors and Mountain West Bank, St. Luke's and St. Al's, and MIEC, who help make this day to inform you for free. IMA Financial Services rounds out the bunch, all helped out with breakfast, the socks, and the lunch. Let's give them an applause, even if they're not here. Well, to get you thus far in your training must mean you're a planner, and now you must master your best bedside manner. For this, I have just the right mentor for you. He's thoroughly equipped in emotional IQ. I'm glad you'll hear him when you are still quite young. Please welcome from St. Luke's Health System, Kris Hartung.
Thanks, Steve. I thought it was on at 8:15, so we're getting started early. Welcome, everyone. So just a show of hands, how many are from the Boise or surrounding area originally? Is that half or so? Great. All right. Let's get started here. Let me jump into the agenda. So this, I'm just going to give you a little forewarning. This is going to be like a crash course in emotional intelligence. Normally I would take at least an hour, preferably a couple hours to do kind of a deep dive. So it's going to be fairly quick, just a tip of the iceberg. I think you have the presentation in your packets, hopefully, and I put a lot of information in the back, including all the research and so forth. So hopefully you have a chance to look at some of that. And if you want more, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is in the deck, and if you want to like the whole iceberg or the majority of it, I can give you that. So a little bit on what I'm going to cover this morning is I'll start with what is emotional intelligence. I know all of you have heard about it before. You can Google it. It's everywhere. Sort of become a cliche buzz term, but I'll give you a current definition of emotional intelligence, including some of the competencies underlying it. And then we'll go into why is it important to physicians and doctors and providers in general. There's a lot of research behind this, so I'll go into that a little bit. We'll do a quick team activity and kind of get your feet wet with some of the skill set, and then I'll talk a little bit about what I've seen in terms of development themes in my work with physicians and emotional intelligence. And again, take a look at that appendix because there's a lot of great information in there. A little bit on myself before I get started. To realize that I can't actually see the text on the screen back there. So I work at St. Luke's here locally, St. Luke's Health System. Started in 2016, and I manage our Provider Wellbeing Center of Excellence system-wide, and I do that with my dyad partner, who's Dr. Katie Schneider from up in Wood River. She's our system medical director for well-being. Does anybody know Dr. Schneider? Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah. So the two of us lead system-wide efforts for provider well-being. We partner with a lot of folks system-wide. So that's a little bit where I'm working. And prior to St. Luke's, I worked at Hewlett-Packard for 27 years. I don't know how that's even possible. A good portion of that I was in human resources, focused on leadership and professional development, and did a lot of coaching and so on. So that's where I got all my background. In terms of my background in emotional intelligence, I am certified as a coach, so I can assess, do development workshops and coach physicians on emotional intelligence. I do part of that for St. Luke's. I do outside of St. Luke's as well. And you'll see that as we go through the presentation here, I refer to some competencies, and that's from this company called Roche Martin. They have probably one of the newest assessment tools and development programs in the industry right now, and that's the model that I use. All right, so let's get started here. This is hopefully sort of a rhetorical question. So this is a show of hands. How many do you think that emotional intelligence is relevant in terms of either the leadership or the practice of medicine. All right, so I expected that. Anybody, I'm going to try to make this somewhat interactive. Why? Anyone? Excellent, yeah. So guiding, influencing, and so on, working with people. Great. Anyone else? Okay, so I think you got it. We'll go more into this as we go through the presentation. I've done a similar presentation and then some workshop for our surgical medical leaders, and I came across this keynote presentation from Dr. Endine, I believe is how you say his name, out of Lexington. Really interesting. If you get a chance, put the URL in there. Check this out. And this is a case. He tells a personal story where, you know, he's a surgeon, obviously, but he had some knee injuries an injury with one of his knees, and he went to see one of the most called upon, highly respected surgeons in his area, and he talks about his experience where the surgeon and doctor knew everything, this expert, but he kind of left the experience really angry and dissatisfied. And he came to the conclusion that what was going on was this seemingly lack of emotional intelligence. So here you have a case where a physician is a patient, they experience this, and then basically he looks in the mirror and asks, well, what am I doing, right? And, you know, you can see the last quote there. It says, it has caused me to wonder how often I see patients and tell them the medically correct answer, yet leave them upset or frustrated because I lack the ability to read their emotional needs. That's kind of the gist of his keynote. But I thought it was really fascinating and very relevant to clinical work. And the key points of that presentation were, you know, our jobs and the positive outcomes we achieve are more than the knowledge and the technical aspects. It's not all about just how smart we are or knowing the correct answer. There's something else going on around above and beyond IQ. Basically, as he says here, why do some individuals who are recognized as highly intelligent and skilled in their field of expertise fail when promoted to high executive positions, and vice versa, an individual who is solid but not necessarily outstanding absolutely takes off? And he attributes this to emotional intelligence. And the research definitely supports this. We'll talk a little bit more of that here in a few minutes. So that's just to get started on the relevance. We'll talk about that more. Now into what is emotional intelligence. I know there are a lot of definitions out there. And, you know, quite honestly, even though I coach to and I assess, I don't like the phrase emotional intelligence personally. It's just become sort of a buzzword. And if you look at the history of it, which started almost 100 years ago, it originally started as social intelligence, and they realized that it was a little too complex, so they settled with emotional intelligence. But this still doesn't ring quite well to me. I'll talk about that here in a second. For me, it's fundamentally about relationships and treating people as human beings, and it's not all about emotions. Some of it's just behavior. So we'll talk about that here in a second. The original graphic I had and thanks Steve for the Dr. Seuss theme. It brought back a lot of childhood memories of books that my mom used to read me. Some of them are kind of frightening. So I originally had an image of a surgeon with a mask, and I think the quote was, "Damn it, Jim, I'm a doctor, not an empath." And so I use this one instead. And the reason why I add this is that there's sometimes this misconception that to be emotionally intelligent, you have to be an emotionally expressive person, or you have to be able to do the Vulcan mind meld and read people's emotions. And it's not true. In fact, in some cases, being highly emotionally expressive can be a detriment depending on the context. So we'll talk more about that, but it's not all about, being emotional. For me, a lot of it's around behaviors that we can learn and apply in the workplace. All right, so this is a definition that I put together. It's really a conglomerate of most of the research from some of the heavy hitters, which are Goldman, he's done a lot of research, Bradbury, Baron, Newman is the key psychologist behind the Roche-Martin model that I use, the assessment tool and the competency model, and Soloway. So these are all some of the big hitters in the history of research. And basically, how I define it is it's a set of skills, traits, or abilities. There is some underlying debate on whether it's skills, traits. And I think from practical, as a practitioner, I see it as all of these, because it all comes out there in the conversations. But there is some underlying debate on whether it's a skill or a trait. I consider it kind of a mix of everything. But these key elements here, one, it's about recognizing and understanding our own emotions. That's where you get into the self-awareness. That's the inner element. Managing our own emotions. And then third, we have recognizing and understanding other people's emotions. Managing relationships based on that information. And then finally, creatively and effectively taking on new challenges. And all this really is geared towards the goal of producing higher quality, more productive, and mutually beneficial relationships, performance, and outcomes. So it's a pretty lengthy definition, but I think it does justice to the research out there. Let's jump into that a little bit more. This is the Roche-Martin competency model, which is not too dissimilar from other models out there. Most competency models for emotional intelligence have anywhere between 7 to 10 competencies, and they're very similar. So this one here is broken into 3 clusters: the inner focus, other, and outer. And inner is mainly around the self-knowing. That's understanding and being aware of your own thoughts and emotions. Not only that, but understanding how your thoughts and emotions impact your behavior. Self-knowing, self-control or self-regulation is basically once how that self-knowledge is regulating your emotions and your behavior. And then we have self-confidence and self-reliance, which are also very important as well. On the other, this would be empathy, probably one of the most common emotional intelligence competencies discussed in the research. This is basically being able to put yourself in other people's shoes, read where they're coming from, and so on. And there's a lot of behaviors that underlie that I'll talk about here in a minute. Relationship skills is another competency. This is basically about how we work with people, treat them as equals, look for mutually rewarding outcomes, and so on. And then our last one here under other is straightforwardness. So this is the ability to clearly communicate our thoughts and feelings or emotions to others. And as you'll see later on, there can be imbalances between some of these competencies. For example, if we get too straightforward, sometimes that can tug away at empathy. If we're too empathetic, sometimes it can come across as we're not being very straightforward. So what we're looking for in this is a balance between all these competencies. Around the outer focus, so this would be adaptability, being able to flex the way we think and our emotions to changes in the environment, not being too rigid. Optimism is our ability to sense opportunities through adversity and challenges. And then self-actualization, not necessarily Maslow's self-actualization, but more around the ability to take on long-term goals and have a work-life balance. So that's a very quick sort of tour of the competency model. We'll do a deep dive in a couple of those here in a minute. So let's get to the question: why is emotional intelligence important to physicians? I think you all kind of instinctually know what the answer is, but let me talk about some of the research. Before we do that, just by anybody, name one emotional intelligence competency, perhaps what I just showed you, that you think is most critical, either in the clinical setting or in the leadership setting. What do you think some of the most critical ones are? Leadership skills. Adaptability. What about in a patient context? All those are true too. Anything else? Right. Empathy. Good. Okay. So this is a very quick tour of what the research is saying, which, by the way, has been going on for almost 100 years, and it's really exploded in the last 10 years to the point where now there's a lot of neuroscience supporting a lot of these competencies, especially around empathy. So what the research is saying right now is, one, emotional intelligence is strongly correlated with leadership effectiveness. And what we mean by leadership effectiveness is being able to influence and lead teams who are highly engaged. They feel valued, they feel recognized, they're productive, high job satisfaction. So many studies that show this clear relationship that leaders who have high emotional intelligence, which we determine through assessment, generally have high engagement index scores as well. Self-awareness and optimism are the strongest predictors of leadership success. Kind of interesting. Third, their emotional intelligence is also a strong predictor of resident and physician well-being and job satisfaction, which is a topic very close to me. I'll talk more about this here in a second. There's also a negative correlation between physician emotional intelligence and the risk of litigation. This is a recent study that came out in the last year. And then emotional intelligence, in particular empathy, is also associated with increased patient satisfaction. I think somebody mentioned that. So that's the summary of the research from a leadership or high-level standpoint. Now, in terms of physician leadership, if you scan the research, it's showing that, one, emotional intelligence is now very much endorsed as a component for curricula. And then it's also cited as essential competencies for physician leaders. And then finally, physicians promoted to leadership roles show higher assessment scores. So I'd just be curious. Yeah, question?
Sorry to interrupt you. That puts in, like, obviously, I think we could all agree.
Time in terms of how you develop it?
No time.
Right. I haven't seen any studies on that. That's a good question. No, I haven't seen any studies that correlate, like how much time is required to actually. Hey, man, you can practice these skills in 30 seconds or an hour, depending on who you're working with. But that's a good question. I'll have to look into that. I do have a question back to you. So, in med school, did any of you, let's be curious, so where we are, was emotional intelligence, relationship building, any of this empathy brought up in any of your curricula? Yeah? That's encouraging. Give me an example. Let's be curious.
Yeah, I had an example for that. In my medical school and training, we did a lot of standardized patient encounters. So every 2 weeks, we would kind of go through the exercise of practicing being the doctor. And one of the competencies was an empathy competency. And so there were some medical students that had to repeat their patient encounters because they failed the empathy portion. And so that was a part that we were graded on. Which seemed kind of like a hard thing to grade on.
Yeah.
But they had criteria that they tried to kind of reasonably make sure that you were
interesting,
or they were addressing in some way. So.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Anything else?
I was just going to add to that. We had a standardized patient that was delivering bad news. That was the whole interaction. It wasn't necessarily about the science behind it, but how do you deliver bad news? So they spent a whole day just on that.
Great.
Now that they're using grading people on, essentially grading applicants on their ability to respond to a prompt and their empathy and blah blah blah, and giving them a score and their admittance based on that.
Great. Well, this is really encouraging, and so it sounds like it's starting to get integrated into curricula more, which is great. That wasn't the case, several decades ago. Any other examples? Okay. All right. And lastly, since this is a topic that I focus on a daily basis, what is the relevance to well-being and burnout? So you may know some of these figures. So looking at 2022 from the AMA data, approximately 51.2% of providers are experiencing some sort of burnout or another. It's basically half of you in this room at some point in time in your career are going to experience some form of burnout. Either the big right, you're already burned out. Either the beginning signs or, 5% of you will experience it to such an extent that it will start to hinder your work. And tons of research on what that might be, everything from preventing you to provide optimal care to errors, not being able to advance, or just hindering you achieving joy in medicine. So this is a pretty serious problem nationwide that we're working on. There are many competencies that are related to this. I quote all the research and the references. You can see it. Self-knowing also is relevant around mindfulness, optimism, and don't let the bad stuff bring you down. Adaptability is really key. Self-actualization. This is mainly around work-life balance, and then relationship skills. A lot of research around showing the power of providing recognition and gratitude actually decreases burnout. So this just a tip of the iceberg there. All right. Okay, so I want to do a team activity. So you have some handouts there, I think, sitting on your tables. And we're going to do a little mini assessment. As you're getting those, what you're going to do is it shouldn't take more than just a couple minutes. So first, take a look at that sheet and just do your own little self-assessment. You can see this, this ranking of 1 to 5, and identify your top strengths in development areas. So a strength would be like a 4 or a 5, and a development area would be a 1 or a 2, or potentially even a 3. So spend some time doing that, and when you're done, you're going to kind of share what your findings with someone next to you, either your strength or a development area, just whatever you're comfortable with, and then I'd like to hear back from you. So we'll give you about 5 minutes or so to do your self-assessment. How's everybody doing? Just about done? Okay. So in essence of time, I figured I'd like to hear from some of you just in whatever you're comfortable with sharing. So let's hear about some of your strengths. Anybody want to volunteer what maybe their top strength was, and how do you think that helps you or will help you in clinical practice?
I'm just going to pick something.
Yeah, sure.
I'm picking.
For my top strength, I put relationship skills and straightforwardness, but I would think relationship skills is more for me, more of a strength. I really do enjoy helping other people achieve their goals and really interested in their perspectives and viewpoints. I feel like I work well with a variety of people. However, I guess that's open to debate. I think otherwise.
Okay. So I'll preface that this is very much a condensed version. When I do this with physicians, they take an extensive self-assessment, but we also do a 360-degree. So their peers, if they're a leader, their direct reports, and their leaders, and other people will pick families, friends, colleagues from school with, and this is what's interesting. We default to the 360 data, and the reason is that people often either underestimate or overestimate their emotional intelligence. And then it's a great coaching question. It's like, okay, so this is where you think you are on these, and this was everyone else. So who's the real you? Person that you think that you are here, or how you appear on the workplace? And it makes for a really interesting conversation. Anyone else have anything else? Sure.
My strength is optimism.
Optimism. Perfect. You'd be a great leader.
Thank you.
Could be a development area if you want to be vulnerable.
A development area. I think sometimes it's hard to say no to things.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, let's give you a little bit of a flavor of what a full assessment would be like. But again, we do a 360, and then this gives a more complete picture. You're wondering, how do we measure this? And a lot of these are behaviors, and if you know, in general, when people do a 360, they might choose anywhere between 20 to 40 raters, right? So you get a lot of information for a coaching discussion. All right, so let's move on. Thanks for doing that. Bear with me on that. So let's talk about some tips on some of those areas. So relationship skills, something that I see a lot that comes off. And what we really mean by that is three components. One, around equality, so recognizing and treating people as equals, not necessarily because equal in terms of subject matter expertise. This equals in terms of being human beings, right? Like everyone has something to offer. Everyone has a viewpoint that can contribute to the whole. Looking for common ground around creating wins for everyone. This is collaborating on outcomes that benefit everyone versus just ourselves. Autonomy. I know that autonomy is really important for physicians. That's what our well-being and burnout data shows. The constant struggle in working in healthcare systems is where you kind of want to run your own show and make decisions, but you have to work with a larger system that might influence you. So this is really about doing that for others, right? So if we want to be autonomous, it's giving other people autonomy as well, allowing them to set their own goals and contribute to decisions and solutions and so on. What's the point? So all this creates trust and respect, which leads to more productive and mutually rewarding outcomes. Next one I'll just cover, empathy. We talked about that. There are demonstrable, observable behaviors that go into empathy. Three components here around listening. Simple, eye contact, body behaviors, nonverbal cues, pausing when we talk. If we're doing a presentation, pausing. Demonstrating curiosity. This is mainly around asking questions, especially open-ended questions. You can imagine this is a good example in the patient context. And then creating this emotional connection, mirroring people's perspective, pre-phrasing what other people say so that they understand that you understand them. What's the point of this? This also builds trust and respect, which increases the chances of you being able to get buy-in for your ideas, influencing others, and so on. All right, I'm not going to go through all these. There's some real examples of empathy in practice. Some of them are from actual Midas. If you're familiar with Midas, Midas is not all used for the bad stuff. Lots of compliments from patients from Midas. There's some really good ones here. There's one, you see the third one there, other empathy. This is a couple months ago. A doctor received a compliment from an elderly patient who left the appointment feeling valued because the doctor explained things in a slow and thoughtful manner because the patient was hard of hearing, right? And so this doctor putting themselves in the patient's shoes. Here's a very poignant one. A physician sat with the patient while he passed away. There were no family members there, and the physician said that no one should ever die alone. So the doctor sat there at the bedside with the patient, held their hand until they passed away. There's some other relationship skills, but lots of great examples. I won't go through all these, but the top one there, it's actually from me. I have a doctor that I see, and one of the first things they ask me is, "Oh, Kris, where do you think we are in your overall treatment plan? I mean, where we are in current state?" And it's like, "Oh, thanks for asking." And it allows me to kind of say, well, I see that you did this test, and last time we were here, and this is basically the doctor checking on my understanding, so they don't have to go read from my chart and tell me a bunch of stuff they already know, right? So I always like that, just kind of establishing a mutual understanding. Under relationship skills, things that I'm seeing in the workplace, a leader basically sets up a brainstorming session with their team to talk about burnout and let them brainstorm and come up with ideas and what they can do to help the team. So that's an example of relationship skills. Or see a lot of in huddles and clinics where physician leaders are doing gratitude rounds for example, or providing recognition to team members or the whole team. More examples. These are some common themes that I've seen in my coaching. One is really interesting is this modulation of emotional intelligence behaviors. So what I see is that, take, for example, empathy. I'll see that a physician leader, physician is rates really good at empathy with their direct reports, for example, but not so well with their peers, or it could be the other way around, or any of those competencies. And just kind of fascinating is that oftentimes we will modulate our behaviors depending on who we're working with, and that leads to an interesting question: is, well, why do we do that? Why is it that this group of people think that you're super empathetic, hopefully you're patient, but yet this other people you work with think you're not empathetic at all? So something's going on. At least some good coaching discussion. Another thing that I found is that I very rarely see a generalized gap in any competency. For example, if someone take empathy, for example. There's several behaviors that go into empathy. And usually if someone, let's say they have at the development area, there's usually one or two behaviors, not all of them. So it's not like you're super great at one thing or super bad all across the board. It's all, there's nuances inside it, basically, which is great because it allows like me to focus on particular behaviors. Some other themes I'm seeing in terms of strengths, in general, lots of exceptions, what I'm seeing is that doctors tend to have pretty high self-confidence, very self-reliant, and oftentimes very straightforward. Some of the development opportunities I see are around empathy, not necessarily with patients, but with their peers. Self-knowing, which is correlated with empathy. Relationship skills, also correlated with empathy. And this discrepancy between the self and the multi-rater, which is fascinating. And there's many, many reasons for that. I can't go in there right now, but that's something that we flesh out. And then some common imbalances and tensions, this empathy versus straightforwardness, is that ideally we want to be both. But if we're too straightforward, people might perceive that as coming across too harsh and not empathetic. If we're too empathetic, then we can be considered somewhat wishy-washy, like we don't have a stance. But both can be done. Being very clear and our expectations and what our point, but also putting ourselves in the shoes of the person we're talking to so that we're understanding where they're coming from. Okay, almost done here. So key takeaways. One, emotional intelligence is a differentiating set of behaviors, especially in the case of leadership, well-being, job satisfaction, patient satisfaction, and so on. Particularly relevant to physicians in terms of building relationships with their colleagues, reducing burnout, increasing patient satisfaction. Some key competencies that we talked about: self-awareness, empathy, optimism, adaptability, relationship skills, and self-actualization. Emotional intelligence can be assessed and it can be developed. It's not fixed like IQ or personality. It can be developed because it's basically around practicing new behaviors. And then if you have any more information, any of this stuff, I'll put my contact, my email, my phone. You can call, text, email. If you want to know more about any of this, feel free to reach out to me. We're out of time unless we have time for any questions. It was a lot. Seemed pretty straightforward.
I have one question. High-functioning autism physicians. I've met a few. High-functioning autism, people on the autistic spectrum who generally oftentimes struggle with the emotional self-awareness. I've met a few doctors over my career here. How do you help them when, like, that emotional self-awareness is like there really is an inbred deficit in many ways just because of how their brain is structured?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I don't know if I've ever met a physician, but it's hard to tell, but in that case, I really zone in on the behaviors and very clear steps and methodologies, but very specific behavior-oriented. So the goal is, in any of this is I'm not changing a person's personality or any of this stuff, but there are really simple, basic behaviors that can be sequenced out that you can literally write on a little sticky note when you go to a meeting that could make all the difference in the world. So it doesn't require radical transformation.
Anybody else? Questions? Let's thank Kris for his time and expertise today.